Right now, when you picture a Viking, you probably see the same thing everyone else does. A burning village, a longship on the horizon, an axe, but raiding season lasted a few weeks a year. So what were they doing for the other 11 months? The answer isn't dragons and glory. It's manure, wool, lawsuits, and dinner parties. And once you see how a Viking actually spent his year, the raids start to make a very different kind of sense. The first thing to understand is that Viking is not really the word we think it is. It was not the name of a people. It was not a race. It was closer to a job description. To go a Viking meant to go on an overseas expedition. So not every person in Scandinavia was a Viking. Most were just Norse farmers, fishers, craftspeople, and traders living in small settlements. And that means the image in your head is backwards. The man who climbed into a longship in July was often the same man who had planted barley in May, the same man who would be home by autumn, hoping the hay had dried before the first frost. Raiding was dramatic, but farming was survival, and survival took almost everything they had. A Viking Age farm was not a neat little house. It was a machine built to keep people alive through winters that could last half the year. The house was usually long, low, dark, and crowded. At the center burned an open fire. There was no chimney in the modern sense. Smoke drifted upward through a hole in the roof, coating the walls, the rafters, the clothes, and probably the people living inside. Imagine waking before sunrise in that room. You're lying on a bench along the wall, covered in wool or animal skins. Around you are your family, perhaps even animals brought inside during severe weather. The fire is low, the air tastes like smoke. Your first task is not adventure. It is making sure the fire is still alive. Because if the fire dies in winter, everything gets harder. You cannot cook, you cannot warm yourself, you cannot dry wet clothes, you cannot see. And then there is the food. People often imagine Vikings eating endless roasted meat and drinking from horns. They did eat meat, but daily life was much less glamorous. Their meals were built around what could survive the climate. Porridge, dried fish, and fermented vegetables were the true staples of the north. Barley, oats, rye in some regions, bread, porridge, dairy, fish, preserved meat, beans, cabbage, onions, apples where they could grow them, berries gathered in season, and a lot of sour or fermented food because fresh food disappears quickly when winter arrives. A cow was not just a cow. It was milk, butter, cheese, leather, meat if things got desperate. Manure for the fields, wealth on 4 legs. That is why stealing livestock was serious, why fencing mattered, why arguments over grazing land could become violent. A lost animal was not a minor inconvenience. It could be the difference between eating and starving. And here is the part that makes the Viking year feel almost unbelievable. The summer was not a break from work. It was a countdown. Every warm day had to be used. Grass had to be cut. Hay had to be dried. Grain had to be harvested. Wood had to be collected. Fish had to be preserved. Roofs had to be repaired. Animals had to be prepared for winter. Tools had to be fixed. A bad summer did not just mean a disappointing harvest. It meant a dangerous winter. So when a Viking left for a raid, he was taking an enormous risk. He was leaving the work that kept his household alive. He was trusting family and neighbors to manage without him. He was gambling that whatever he brought back would be worth the danger. And sometimes it was. A successful raid could bring silver, weapons, cloth, livestock, and the kind of wealth a farm could never produce. But most Vikings did not return with a chest full of gold. Some never returned at all. The sea was dangerous, navigation was difficult, disease spread quickly in cramped boats. Coastal settlements might contain armed men. So why do raids dominate the story? Because the people being raided wrote about them. A farmer in Norway milking a cow did not leave behind a terrified account of his morning, but a monk watching strangers appear absolutely did. The attack was remembered because it was sudden. The ordinary life behind it disappeared because ordinary life always disappears first. But the Vikings were not just farmers who occasionally became raiders, they were also traders. And trade may have been just as important as violence. By the Viking Age, Scandinavian ships were traveling across an astonishing amount of the world. West to Ireland, England, Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America. East through rivers that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. South toward the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. They carried furs, walrus ivory, iron, amber, soapstone, cloth, slaves, and animal products. They brought back silver coins, silk, spices, glass, wine, jewelry, and ideas. This is one of the strangest things about the Viking world. A person living in a smoky wooden house on the edge of a northern field might own a small piece of silver minted thousands of miles away. They might wear glass beads that had crossed multiple trade routes. They might hear stories about cities so large that the whole population of their village could fit into one street. The Viking world was more connected than it looked, and some of its most important places were not battlefields, they were markets. Hedeby, in what is now northern Germany, became one of the largest trading towns in northern Europe. Birka in Sweden connected Scandinavia to eastern trade routes. Kaupang in Norway drew merchants from across the region. These places were loud, crowded, and multicultural in a way that would have been impossible in a remote farmstead. You could hear different languages. You could buy combs made from antler, tools made from iron, beads, cloth, and imported goods. You could meet a merchant from another kingdom, a shipbuilder looking for work, or a traveler carrying news from a place you would never see. And this trade changed the meaning of a raid. Sometimes the difference between trader and raider was not as clean as we want it to be. A ship could arrive peacefully and exchange goods. Or it could arrive, realize there was no resistance, and take what it wanted. The same routes that carried silver and cloth could carry armed men. The same longship could be used for commerce one month and violence the next. That is uncomfortable. But it is also true. The Viking Age was not a simple world of good merchants and bad raiders. It was a world where power traveled by water and people used that power in different ways depending on opportunity. Then there were the craftspeople. Vikings made nearly everything by hand. Their clothes had to be spun, woven, dyed, sewn, repaired, and passed down. Their buildings had to be cut from timber, fitted together, covered, and constantly maintained. Their boats needed skilled shipbuilders who understood wood, balance, rope, sails, and the terrifying logic of the sea. A long ship was not just a vehicle, it was advanced technology. The ships were light, fast, and flexible. They could cross open water, but they could also move up shallow rivers. They could be pulled onto beaches. They could land almost anywhere. They could appear where defenders least expected them, then disappear before an army could gather. That ability helped create the Viking reputation. But building a ship like that required patience. It required oak, iron rivets, tar, wool sails, and thousands of hours of labor. A sail alone could require huge amounts of wool and work from many households. So behind every famous Viking ship was not just a captain. It was an entire community. Women spun the yarn, farmers raised the sheep, craftspeople shaped the wood, smiths made the nails, sailors learned the routes, families made sacrifices so the expedition could happen. And women were doing far more than waiting at home. They managed farms, they produced textiles, they prepared and preserved food. They could inherit property in some Norse societies. They could seek divorce under certain conditions. Elite women were sometimes buried with keys, objects that may have represented their authority over a household and its resources. That does not mean Viking society was equal. It was not. It was deeply hierarchical. Enslaved people had almost no freedom. Most power belonged to men, especially wealthy men. Violence shaped daily life in ways that are hard to imagine. But the popular image of Viking women as background characters is wrong. A household could not function without them, and neither could a raid. Because while the men were away, someone had to make sure the farm still existed when they came back. Then there were the laws. This is where the Viking world becomes almost unrecognizable, because these people we imagine as wild, axe-swinging pirates spent a remarkable amount of time arguing about rules. They gathered at public assemblies called things. A thing was part court, part parliament, part marketplace, and part social event. People came together to settle disputes and hear laws. There were no printed law books on every shelf. Laws were often memorized and recited by a law speaker, an entire legal system stored inside somebody's head, and the laws could be extremely specific. Who inherited property? What happened if someone damaged a neighbor's fence? How compensation worked after an injury? Because in a world without modern police, punishment could not always mean prison. Often, it meant payment. If you injured someone, you might owe silver. If you killed someone, your family might have to pay compensation. If you refused, the conflict could grow into a feud lasting generations. And exile was one of the worst punishments of all. To be declared an outlaw meant people could take your property. They could drive you from society. In some cases, they could kill you without consequences. For a person whose survival depended on kin and a place at the fire, being cast out was almost a death sentence. So, no, Vikings were not living in chaos. They lived inside complicated networks of obligation, reputation, family, law, and fear. They told stories too. Long before their myths were written down, they were spoken aloud in halls around fires. Stories about Odin, Thor, Loki, and the end of the world. But the myths were not just entertainment. They explained why storms came, why winter was terrifying, why people died, why honor mattered. They believed the world would end. Ragnarok was not a distant idea. It was a final battle where gods, monsters, and humans would be destroyed. Then, somehow, life would begin again. Maybe that is why their stories feel so intense. The Viking world was already intense. A bad harvest could kill you. A fever could kill your child. A shipwreck could erase an entire crew. Everything was fragile, which brings us back to the raids. The raids were not separate from everyday Viking life. They came from it. They came from small farms with limited land, from ambitious young men trying to gain wealth and status, from shipbuilding skills, from a society where reputation mattered enough that people would risk everything. The burning village was real. The axe was real. But so was the woman at the loom. The farmer spreading manure, the child feeding animals, the trader weighing silver, the shipbuilder bending planks. That was the Viking world. Not a civilization built entirely on raiding, a civilization built on work. And every summer some climbed into longships and gambled that violence could buy them a better life than the soil ever could.